So we are in outcome number 2, and outcome number 2 requires us to be able to evaluate the skills that are needed by a system analyst. So we need to look at the skills. We should be able to do an evaluation on the skills that are needed by a system analyst. And the first thing that we need to look at is the role of the system analyst in an information systems project. What will the analyst do? What will the analyst do, or what is basically the role of the system analyst uh, in an information systems project? What is the role of the system analyst in an information systems project? So before we actually talk about the role, we need to know who is a system analyst. A system analyst is actually a professional in the information technology who specializes in analyzing, designing, and implementing information systems. So he's a professional that has special skills, or is focused, or is actually specialized in the area of analyzing, designing, and even implementing information systems. So he's the person that normally assesses the suitability of an information system, checks if that information system is actually suitable, and is doing this uh, uh, in terms of the outcomes that are actually intended for that particular system. And we will also going to rely or to liaise with the end users of the system, not just the end users of the system. Is also going to liaise with the software vendors and even the programmers of that particular system to make sure that the outcomes that are intended of that system are achieved. So he's a person who normally uses the analysis and even design techniques to bring a solution to a business problem. So he's going to use analysis and design techniques to solve business problems, of course, using information technology. Okay, we have other system analysts that can serve as change agents. Okay, and their work is to actually identify the improvements that are needed in the organization, then to design systems that can actually implement those improvements or implement those changes. And more of that, they can actually train and motivate others to actually use the systems that have been implemented. Now, a system analyst might be familiar to some programming languages, but it's not necessarily that they need to have programming experience. So they might have some familiarity with programming languages, they might have some familiarity with operating systems, they must have some familiarity with computer hardware platforms. Um, as much as they might have some familiarities in these areas, they don't actually get involved in the actual hardware and software development. The actual development, the actual construction of both hardware and software does not involve these analysts. So their area of focus, or their area of responsibility, can be maybe developing the cost analysis. Look at how much is it going to cost us for this particular project. They may look at the design considerations. In other words, how will this system look? They can also look at the implementation timelines. When do we actually need to have to have this system fully implemented and all that, but they do not take part in the actual construction of the system. So the analyst is confined to an assigned or maybe a given system. He is not going to focus on other systems. He's just going to confine himself to a system that is a given system, and most of the time he's going to work with incognito with the business analyst. A business analyst is actually a person who understands the business domain um, in which the business problem lies, the problem that you are trying to solve. Then you need to work with somebody who has the expertise in that business. Now, at times the two roles might overlap. At times the two roles might overlap. The role of the system analyst and the role of the business analyst. But it needs to be understood that these roles are not the same. Because the business analyst is just going to look at the business need and is going to identify what is the appropriate solution, and is also going to look at to some extent a design solution. But the business analyst is not going to dive deep into the technical components of that particular solution. A system analyst, on the other hand, is going to modify, is going to look at, is going to do an evaluation and also modify code, is also going to review some scripting. Yeah, so the business analyst is not involved in the technical aspect of the system, or the system analyst is involved. So we have we have people, we have professionals that are dedicated, and they post they possess they have both the practical knowledge in all the two areas, in the business and also in the system analyst. So they can actually manage to combine both of the two occupations and actually work effectively without having a distinction between the business analyst and the system analyst. In other words, I'm saying we have professionals that can work as business analyst and as system analyst at the same time, or the same people working in all those areas. So then, what are the roles of the system analyst? What role does the system analyst play? There are a number of roles that the system analyst play in information system projects. And the first one is to identify, to understand, and to plan. To identify, to understand, and to plan for both organizational and also the human impacts of the planned systems. So it's going to plan for the impact of the organization. It's going to plan for the human impacts of the system, and is also going to make sure that if we have new technical requirements for the system, they are going to be integrated properly with the processes and skills that are already existing. Remember, we are trying to computerize, or we are trying to bring a technological solution to a problem. It does not mean that we don't have an existing solution. We might have an existing solution that is not technological. So it is the work of the system analyst to make sure that he identifies, he understands, and he even plans on the impact of the planned systems, and making sure that the technical requirements of the system can properly be uh, used in conjunction to, or they can properly be integrated with the processes that are existing, and with even the skill sets that are existing. So the other role is he has the role to plan a system flow. from the ground up. By ground up, I simply mean from the beginning to the end. He has a role to plan a system flow from from the beginning, from the bottom, when we just have the idea, to the point where we are going to have a complete system. He also has the role to interact with both internal users and the external users of the system. To interact, the external users of the system in this case can be customers. So he has the role to actually interact with the users and to interact with the customers, to make sure that he learns and also he documents the requirements that are actually used currently to produce the business required documents. Then he has the role to write the technical requirements from maybe a critical phase onwards. He has the role to interact with the software architect, the person who is actually going to build the software, so that he can understand what limitations are there in the software. The system analyst also has a role to make sure that he is going to work with the programmers to help the programmers during the system development. For example, making sure that he provides the use cases, making sure that he provides the flowcharts, making sure that he provides the unified modeling language and the BPMN diagrams to the programmers of the system during the system development. He also has a role to make sure that he documents the requirements or contributes to the system user manuals at the end of the system. Now, whenever we have a development process that is actually being conducted, we have the system analyst taking the responsibility of designing the components and also giving the information or the designed components to the person who is actually going to develop uh, 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 the system. To looking at requirement techniques or requirements gathering techniques. Now, it is of essence for us to understand that the system analyst needs to understand what the system requires or what are the expected requirements of that particular system. What do we actually require of the system? What should the system do? What are the functionalities of the system? Now, because we need to know the requirements of the system, then it is of essence and it is of wisdom to actually learn the techniques that are used to collect those requirements, the methods and the various techniques that are used to actually gather those requirements of the system. Okay, after the planning phase, of course, we have a phase that comes next in the software development life cycle, and that phase is the analysis phase. The analysis phase, on the other hand, or the analysis phase is the most essential phase in the entire software development life cycle phase, because it is within this phase where the project is actually studied. The requirements are looked at in this particular phase. So there was a study that was done by a project management consulting company known as the PM Solutions, that identified the top cause of a troubled project. The study that was done identified poor requirements as the top cause of projects that are actually troubled, or in other words, projects that are not successful. So the top cause of projects that are not successful, according to this project management consulting company, the PM Solutions, is poor requirements. So what they are trying to say is, if you are going to experience a project that is failing or a project that has difficulties to actually achieve its goals or actually bring out the outcomes, then it basically means that there was poor requirements. So when we look at the 2004 chaos report that came from the Standish group, uh, they actually indicated that the project's success that were rated only at 34%. The project success was rated only at 34%, while we had the rest percentage going uh, 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 into either the category of changed projects or failed projects. In other words, out of 100%, according to the 2004 chaos report, there are 34% projects that were successful, and the rest were failed projects or challenged projects. And the percentage that remains there is 66%. Now, 66% are failed project or changed projects. Now, based on that report, then you would understand that um, the requirements is actually one of the most important aspects to consider when coming up or when working on a project. Now, according to what they noted, they also brought it out that uh, the poor requirements were the most common in project failures. Like you see, we have a bigger percentage of projects failing, and the most common reason for the project failures, according to the 2004 chaos report, was that there was poor requirements. There was poor requirements. Okay, that was listed on their third and on their third list of common factors of project failures. Now this is interesting enough because they also noted that apart from having the poor requirements, there was lack of stakeholder involvement. There was lack of stakeholder involvement. In other words, the the projects that were done, they were not involving the stakeholders, they were not involving the people that are actually funding the projects. So there was implementation of projects by the people who are actually working on the projects without involving the stakeholders or the people that fund the projects, and that led to a bigger number of failed projects. Okay, now we can also tie this misinvolvement or poor involvement or lack of involvement of the stakeholders to poor requirements, because if you involve the stakeholders, it means you're going to get more clarity of what is required of the project. If you do not actually involve them, then it means you're not going to get clear requirements. So at some point, you see those two factors are actually tying on to each other. If you're not going to involve the stakeholders heavily, then that means you're not going to have a poor dialogue. You're going to have a poor communication between the analyst and also and the stakeholders, and that is going to lead to poor requirements. Now, if you have poor requirements, then you need to understand what poor requirements can do on the end results of a system or a project. Okay. Now, the requirements act as a blueprint. They act as a blueprint, the project. So they are the blueprint that actually every person that is involved in the development of the project uses to actually play their duty or to work. Whoever is actually taking part in that project, the person has a blueprint to follow or to actually use. And the blueprint in this case is the requirement. So when you have requirements that are poor, then it means you might end up having poor designs, you might end up having poor tests, and this is going to actually bring delays in the development and even in the testing phases of the system. So once you have identified the requirements, then it is very important that you revisit the requirements or you revise the requirements. Okay? If you have them poor, then it means you need to revise them. When you revise the requirements because they are actually poor, then it means you're going to have delays because you're going to spend more time revising requirements instead of going on with the development of the project. Now that means you're going to have more delays and the project is going to be to actually delay to be completed. Now again, you can have poor product quality. Okay, poor product quality can also come from poor requirements. So basically, to simplify things, what is the impact of poor requirements? One, there is going to be delay in the project. There is going to be delay, and the delay will come where we have to revise the requirements. We have to spend time revising the requirements. Number two, we can have poor product quality. We can have poor product quality, especially in areas where we did not look at the key components. We did not actually give a key and a keen interest on the key components of the system. We overlooked them. You can overlook the key components. At times you actually left them out. In other words, you did not consider them. Okay. Again, we need to focus also on another important aspect um, to identify what is actually important in a system, and that is testing. If you have unclear requirements or if you have requirements with errors, then you cannot do testing properly. Okay? And because you cannot do testing properly, then it means you're going to have poor quality. Now, to avoid having poor requirements, since having poor requirements has negative impacts, including project's delay and poor quality of the project or the final product, then to avoid poor requirements, it is of essence and it is very important to make sure that you go through the analysis phase of the system development life cycle thoroughly and completely. You don't overlook anything. You go through the analysis phase thoroughly and completely. Now, if we look at the analysis phase, we can actually break the analysis phase into two processes. We can break the analysis phase into two processes. The two processes include one, gathering the requirements, and number two, analyzing the requirements. We can break the analysis phase into two processes. One, gathering the requirements, where we now collect the requirements, then analyzing the requirements. Now, the requirements also can be divided into two. Don't be confused here. We have divided the analysis phase into two, and the first phase is gathering into two processes. The first process is gathering of the requirements, and the second process is analyzing the requirements. But again, when we look at the requirements, we can have different types. We can have two types of the requirements, and the two types of the requirements can, or in other words, we can divide the requirements into two, into either functional requirements or into non-functional requirements. So as we have gathered the requirements, we can group those requirements into two, into functional requirements and into non-functional requirements. Now, what are functional requirements? Functional requirements, we define them as processes, information, and even interactions. So what we collect as requirements, we group those requirements that are processes, those requirements that are actually information, and those requirements that are actually interactions. We group them to functional requirements. So the group of functional requirements will contain the requirements that are processes, the requirements that are information, and the requirements that are interactions. Okay, now this group will give you the desired functionality, the desired functionality that the client actually wants you to build. They are going to give you the desired functionality. When we talk about the desired functionality, we are talking about the processes. They are also going to describe uh, how the system is going to interact with the environment. They're going to describe how the system is going to interact with the environment. Yeah, and that is the aspect of interactions. Now the aspect of information is basically is how data and information is actually processed within the system. Okay, now generally the functional requirements will describe what the system has to do. The functional requirements will describe the system, what the system has to do. Now the non-functional requirements on the other hand are uh, um, the non-functional requirements on the other hand are the non-functional characteristics. They are those characteristics that address the operational and the technical requirements. Okay, they address the operational and the technical requirements. They might be describing factors like encryption, the encryption of data. Encryption is actually converting some meaningful information into some meaningless texts. Of course, using an encryption algorithm that is actually known by the sender and the recipient, um, and also using some key in that encryption process. So the factors such as encryption, the factors such as security, the factors such as hosting, the factors such as the environment, the factors such as disaster recovery, the factors such as the continuity of the business. All these factors fall under the non-functional. All the requirements that address these factors, they fall under the non-functional requirements of the project. Okay. To ensure that you do not have poor requirements, then you are actually supposed to make sure that you do proper requirements gathering. Now, to have proper requirements gathering then also means that you need to have proper selection of the technique that you can use to gather the requirements. Poor requirements are normally as a result of poor gathering of the requirements and poor selection of the requirement gathering technique. So there are various requirements gathering techniques ranging from interviews. We have interviews. We have question no, not question yeah we have questionnaires, we have observations, we have apart from observations, we also have analyzing existing documents or literature reviews, etc, 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 etc. We have various techniques, and the first one that I'm going to begin talking about is interviews. Interviews. We have two types of actually more types of interviews. We have the one-on-one interviews, we have the group interviews. I'll basically focus on the two types of interviews. So interviews is the first requirement gathering techniques, and the interview requirement gathering technique is actually divided into two types. We have the one-on-one interviews and we have the group interviews. The one-on-one interviews is actually a technique that is commonly used for the gathering, for the requirement gathering, or for gathering requirements. It is one of the primary sources of requirements, so to say. Now, the one-on-one interview, is actually a technique that helps you to get the most out of an interview. Yeah. Now, because it helps you to get the most out of the interview, then you need to make sure that you have well thought about it and you have actually prepared yourself well before you sit down with the person to interview, the person that we actually call the interviewee. So the analyst here is actually supposed to identify the stakeholders that is going to interview. The stakeholders can be maybe users who are going to interact with or who are interacting with the current system, or who will interact with the new system that you are intending to build. The stakeholders can be management. The stakeholders can be project financiers, the people that actually are going to finance your project, or anyone else that is going to be involved in the system. When a system analyst is preparing for an interview, it is actually important to ask both open-ended questions and the closed-end questions. Now, this brings into your attention the two types of questions that can be asked in an interview. We have the open-ended questions and we have the closed-ended questions. Now, the open-ended questions are actually questions that we use to enable us to obtain more valuable information based maybe on the individual and also uh, 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 um, the way different people interact with the system, the way different people view the system, and also the system itself. When you have open-ended questions, basically here you are supposed to the respondent or the interviewee is going to give detailed explanation based on their views, based on how they interact with the system and based on the system itself. So there are type of questions that requires the interview to actually explain. The interviewee will explain or is going to describe what they think, what they think, what is their thought about the system or about the question you have actually asked them. There are type of questions that you cannot answer with a yes or a no. There are questions that requires explanation. There are questions that requires description. For example, you can ask the interviewee what they like about the current system or how they use it, how they use the current system. So they are kind of questions that allow the analyst to actually probe further to get more details with some follow-up questions. You can ask the question, and as the interviewee is actually explaining, you get another question that will help you get a clear information, and you ask them in the midst of the explanation. That is going to help you to get more details. So questions like, what are some of the problems you face on daily basis? These are closed-ended questions. They are very useful. They can be useful in areas, for example, when you as an interviewer, you are looking for a specific answer. They can actually provide specific answers for the interviewee to actually choose from. In formats, you can actually provide some specific answers for the interviewee to choose from. In formats, maybe you can include true or false or maybe multiple choices. Now, when you are using this format of open-ended questions where you have provided the interviewee with options to choose from, one thing you need to understand is that this type are not going to provide you with as much details as the other type. Though they can be helpful to cover, or to provide more details as the open ended. During the interview, the interviewer should actually obtain permission from the interviewee that you want to use recorders. Yeah? You don't just record someone without their permission. You need to get consent. So you need to tell the interviewee that you might use recorders in the interview. So you obtain their consent. This is to ensure that if you miss some details while you're taking your notes, then you can easily retrieve them later. So you can use recorders in the interview to capture missed details later. But to do that, you need to get the consent of the interviewee. By the end of the interview, you need to make sure that you are providing the results to the interviewee. Make sure that you're providing the results to the interviewee so that the interview can confirm their responses, the responses that they have given through the interview. So the second type of interview is the group interview. So there's no big difference between the one-on-one interview and the group interview. They are more of similar, except that in the group interview, you are actually interviewing more than one person. Yeah. So these group interviews normally work well if we have interviews that are at the same level or maybe same position in the company. They also have an advantage if there is a time constraint. Since more thoughts here and discussions can be generated, someone in the group may state or maybe suggest an idea that may have been overlooked by others, and in turn that can lead to a discussion, or it can provide more information maybe on a particular topic or a particular issue within the interview. So it is in the hands of the interviewer to actually gauge which issues are more generally agreed upon and which one or which other issues actually people are differing. Now, the group interview has a major disadvantage. That is majorly scheduling the interview. Scheduling a group interview can be a great challenge, especially when you have you are involving more than one person. It's difficult. It's also time consuming in establishing the dates for the interview, the time for the interview that actually works for both the people you want to interview is a little bit difficult. Enough with interviews. I want us to move to the next technique, which is questionnaires. Questionnaires are also referred to as surveys. Questionnaires or surveys normally allow the analyst to collect some information from many people in a short period of time. This is also useful when you are collecting information to stakeholders that are located in different positions geographically, or if you have hundreds of respondents that you need their input to help in establishing the system requirements. Now, very important to note is that when you are using the questionnaires, you need to have questions that are focused and that are really organized by a feature or maybe the project objective. You need to include questions that are focusing on the objective of the project and not questions that are really out or they're not helping in actually getting the requirements. Another thing to really look at when you're dealing with questionnaires, don't have questions that are too long. Make sure you have questions that are not too long, and this is to make sure that you have the users complete all the questions easily. Again, put to a realization that when you are building or you're making a questionnaire, you need to use the general guidelines to determine that the question, which questions are going to be asked. For example, how, where, when, who, what, and why. For how, questions like how will you use this feature? How might we meet this business need? How will we know this is complete? Examples of questions that are focusing on where can be questions like where does the process start? Where would the user access this or that feature? Where would the result be visible? Examples of questions that focus on when can be questions like when will this feature be used? When will this feature fail? Or when will we be ready to start? Now there can be questions like for who? For example, who will use this feature? Or who will deliver the inputs for the feature? Or who will deliver the outputs of the feature? There can include questions that are actually asking the question, what? And examples include, what do I know about this feature? What does this feature need to do? What is the end result? Or what must happen next? So that's it with questionnaires. There's not much about that. There are so many available templates and available examples of or available guidelines into the establishing of questionnaires online. So when establishing a questionnaire, you can work with your own template, or if you're finding difficulties, then choose to adapt a template from the online available resources. The other technique that we are going to focus on is the user observation. Now, in user observation here, you are going to observe the people or the user directly here. As much as the interviews and questionnaires provide valuable user feedback, of course, based on the questions that you ask, at times there are other situations and other scenarios that it will be more suited if you are going to observe the user on your own. So for you to make sure that you have a better understanding of the user in their current environment, their current working environment, as an analyst, you may observe the user themselves. User observation is very helpful. It assists in the analyst by getting a full grasp of how the user is actually interacting with the system firsthand, because you're not asking questions here, you are looking, you're observing what the user is actually doing. So if you have an objective of improving maybe a task, then as an analyst you can observe the user and how the environment or the surrounding of that user actually is affecting how the user interacts with the system. Sometimes you may have stakeholders that are actually finding it difficult to explain some exact tasks of the system, or maybe a process, or what the requirements of the system could be. So in these cases, then observing the users in such cases is going to actually provide you the requirements that the users and the stakeholders are not able to explain or bring them out clearly for you. Also, user observation is important or useful maybe when you're doing data validation. If you are validating data that has already been collected or was collected previously, in such cases, then you have users that can provide misleading information, or they cannot maybe fully recollect all of the tasks and how they are using the system. So here you're going to use the user observation to actually plan and make sure that you get all the elements that are surrounding the observation. User observation is going to assist in taking out uncertainty. It is also going to bring the focus on the user and also assist on what things to actually look for. Now, at times, the analyst might be distracted here and record or maybe note some irrelevant issues. So it is very important to be very careful here. You gather the more important or the more useful information in the less time that it is going to take you as the analyst to actually dissect and actually evaluate afterwards. It is also important to take keen notice on the timing of the observation, because this can also be relevant when you're planning for the system, or when you're planning to get the optimal results. You should actually schedule maybe 3 different periods of observations. One of which is going to be low, the other one is going to be normal, and the other one is going to be at peak times, especially when you are observing a user in an environment where he's dealing with other people. There are times when the customers there are low in numbers, and there are times when the numbers are normal. There are times when the numbers are at the peak. So you need to make sure you observe in all those times, so that to make sure you improve or to help you yourself to improve the understanding on how the user interacts with the system based on the different times. How does the user interact with the system when the customer numbers are low, when the customer numbers are normal, and when the customer numbers are at the peak? So you need to put into consideration those differences in times and even in time settings, and you actually use them to get a better understanding and a better requirements that are going to assist you to look keenly into those 3 different times. Now, when you, as the analyst, are observing the user, there are 2 approaches that you can take, or there are 2 approaches the analyst can take while observing the user. The first one is you can take the passive approach, or you take the active approach. So in other words, I'm trying to say we have the passive observation and we have the active observation. So in passive observation, the analyst or the consultant here is not going to interact with the user while they are working. The analyst or the consultant will sit down and observe secretly and quietly as the user is actually working. Now, they simply observe and take notes. They are not participating they are not interacting with the user as the user is working. Now, on the other hand, in the active observation, the consultant or the analyst here can ask the user some questions during the session, um, and observations are actually always being done here without bias. If you compare these requirement gathering techniques with other requirement gathering techniques, so the analyst must be simple or must simply record what that user presents to them, and the analyst should avoid making comments on whether they believe what is correct and what is not correct. You just pick what the user presents to you as a response. You do not make comments. Again, the analyst here can use a checklist. It can be very useful, especially when it comes to looking at the points, the key points that you have already noted and the key points that you have not noted. You can use a checklist to actually tick out the key points that you have already noted. Now, you can check if maybe a user uses certain features. You can check the frequency of events, triggers that cause maybe different uses, etc. It's very helpful to take detailed notes to make sure that you record unexpected events. There may be events that maybe are unknown to the analyst, maybe in ahead of time. You can really capture those events by taking notes of the event and why that event actually occurred. Here, you can also use video recorders, but for you to use video recorders, you make sure that the user and the company have approved you to use video recorders. There are many advantages to user observation, but there are also some disadvantages that are associated with it as well. I have mentioned this previously that observations should take place during the peak, the normal, and also the low business times. But at times this might be, it may be difficult to actually get enough information in one of these sessions. For example, getting enough information in the peak times. There may be need, therefore, to have multiple sessions to make sure that you verify the facts that you collected rather than isolating the incidents. Analysts here can actually observe they can sometimes be biased in what they expect to see and in what they see. As a person, you move into an organization for the session, there is that what you expect to see and there is that what you see. At times, there can be biasness, and that is a second disadvantage. I said the first disadvantage is that in some sessions, it might be very difficult to actually collect facts. And the second disadvantage is the biasness of the analyst. Again, put your focus into simply focusing the facts and not to have any biased opinion when you are actually observing the working environment. Another disadvantage is the users of the particular system may at times give you an accurate depiction of their everyday task, and sometimes they might respond differently, especially in scenarios where the user knows that they are being observed. They might respond, or they might behave differently from the way they normally behave. So that is also a disadvantage because it is going to give you a wrong result. In this same area, we might have some other users becoming nervous and others might not actually perform things normally as they would have performed if they were not under observation. Now, at times you might have other users trying to perform better or maybe work harder when they know you are actually observing them. These observations might actually limit the deciphering of the analyst in actually what is the true requirements and what is the actual requirement. So the other technique is analyzing existing documents. And analyzing the existing documents simply means here you are reviewing um, uh, 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 um, documents that were previously prepared. This is useful uh, in requirements gathering. Also on its own, when you are actually using it to supplement other techniques. In other words, you can use analyzing existing documents as a technique together with other technique. It is going to help the analyst to understand the business, also to understand the system, or to understand the current situations. If you have existing documents that you are actually analyzing, they can provide you as the analyst maybe the titles and the names of the stakeholders that are being involved in the system. And that is going to help you to create questions for interviews or maybe questionnaires to ask those stakeholders in regards to actually gaining some additional requirements. If the analyst is not sure of maybe procedures that are in place, these documents can also help that analyst in getting or in asking questions during interviews. So when you're studying the requirements as an analyst, you may find problems that they may actually distinguish them, or they may be distinguished on their own. You may find there are some missing information maybe in old documents, or you may find there is redundancy in which we have steps that are unnecessarily repeated. You may also look at old requirement documents and reuse those requirements if they are still relevant, and you discard or you release or you put away those requirements that they are out of date or they are outdated. Now, the reason as to why we have the current the reason as to why we have the current system being designed can also be suggested by certain features that were actually left out in the previous system, and this can be found in the existing documents. In the existing documents, still you can get principles, you can get rules for the organization itself. You can also use analyzing existing documents as a supplement to maybe information that you obtained from interviews, information you obtained from questionnaires, and even observations. A good example can be if some of the interview answers are unclear, maybe the organizational documents here may help you in making some sense of those interview answers. So reviewing these documents may also assist you in understanding why a user performs some certain tasks while you observe them. So it is a technique that can actually work in handy with other techniques. There is a drawback to this technique, or a disadvantage to this technique, or a weakness to this technique, and it is that you might be analyzing documents that are outdated. Okay, and maybe as an analyst you don't have a way to confirm if these documents are current or they are not. That is one of the drawback. There's another drawback also, that is in matters of time. Analyzing existing documents is time consuming. It can be very time consuming. That is, of course, on dependent on the organization and the system itself. So we have a system that might be that can interact with many different facets of a business, and that is going to lead to into a system having many or large amounts of documents, and you actually going through all those documents is going to be difficult and also time consuming at the same time. Those are the number of drawbacks that we have with this technique. Okay. Those techniques that we have discussed so far are examples of the traditional requirements gathering techniques. We have a more contemporary method for gathering requirements where the joint application design is an example. So we're going to look at the joint application design, but what I want you to know is that the joint application design is actually one of the contemporary method for gathering requirements. The previous techniques that we have discussed are examples of the traditional requirements gathering techniques. So looking at the joint application design, the JAD, that was developed and was introduced in the late 1970s, and it was brought in so that it can solve some of the problems that the users are experiencing in the conventional methods that were used to gather techniques, to gather requirements that I have actually mentioned. When the organizations began adopting or began using the JAD, there were reports that there has been savings of about 40% or even more in the project designing time. In other words, they saved 40% of the time in comparison to the traditional methods. So it is the JAD is really successful when it comes to reducing the time in the requirements gathering and analysis, and this is because we have the user and the other key members being involved in the process. Now the goal of JAD is to get a design right at the first time. You get a design right at the first time. This reduces the different interactions, or rather different iterations. So it is JAD is normally conducted in at a location other than the place where the people involved work, and this is helping to reduce distractions, as we have seen in the observation, especially at the peak hours. There can be distraction. The analyst can be distracted by less essential or less important events. The joint application development has a leader. The joint application development sessions, they have leaders, and these leaders, we normally call them facilitators. So they can be users, they can be managers, they can be sponsors, they can be system analysts, they can be scribes, and even other information system staff members. Now, the facilitator is usually trained in project management as well as system analysis. You can't just become a facilitator if you're not trained in project management. So he's the one that manages the entire process. They have the responsibility of making sure that the group agenda is actually kept and conflicts that arises in the sessions are resolved. They do not give ideas. They do not contribute to the group. They also have the responsibility of making rules for the sessions, and they are also able to dismiss anyone who is um, bringing trouble into the process. Um, they make sure there is user involvement. Um, so users may be actually involved in the JAD sessions, and that involvement can make lots of contributions. They are also going to be the ones that they use. They're going to be the ones to use the new systems to check also how those systems operate and to make sure that all the functionalities are taken care of. Okay. The sponsor of the project does not really attend the JAD sessions, but they can contribute ideas, usually either at the beginning or at the end of other projects. They can uh, uh, at the end of at the end or at the beginning of the project, they can actually be present and contribute some ideas. But now, when it comes to the entire development process, they don't contribute any ideas. They are just the main sponsors. They just become the main sponsors. So we have system analysts in the JAD, and they are presently there to learn from the users and also to learn from the managers. Um, um, just like in other requirements gathering techniques, the JAD should not have bias. So we have the scribe, and the scribe is basically the person who documents or writes the proceedings of the sessions. They prepare the documents in throughout the sessions. They also do not contribute anything into the discussion of the session. So we also have other information system staff members. For example, the programmers, we have the database analysts that can also attend, and the main reason of their presence is to contribute to the technical aspects of the ideas that are actually proposed in those sessions. So we have benefits or advantages of the JAD that include: one, we have the consolidation of months of work into a structured workshop. Number two, we have the clarification of the specification requirements in an environment that is actually taking care of consensus. In other words, all these people are coming into an agreement into the proposed specifications. Okay. Another advantage or another benefit is that it is going to identify the open issues and also the parties that are actually responsible for their solutions or for their resolutions. So if we have any open issues, which parties are actually responsible for the resolution of those issues? Another benefit is that they will tie together the steps of the design process in a concise document. Also, they increase user satisfaction by having direct involvement of users in the designing process. They also build commitment through the use of the executive sponsor. We have the executive sponsor in there, so there is commitment building. So the process also builds a sense of belonging, since it is helping us to create a cohesive team through both physical and social setting. So as much as we can see, the joint application development, a method at work, and a method that is actually better and improved as compared to the traditional methods. And we have another method that comes in and it is the AJ, AJAD, AJAD. AJAD is actually automated JAD. The A stands for automated. Okay. So as much as we see as much as we see the JAD as a newer method, we have some instances where the JAD was actually developed further into a JAD, or in other words, into an automated JAD. So the traditional JAD setting will actually happen in a conference room of some type, with maybe having a U-shaped table. We have the documents on the table. We have the whiteboards that are going to be used to write ideas. We also have the agenda that is actually posted on a wall or projected on a screen by a projector. So in an automated JAD session, here the users are still going to be sitting in a U-shaped table, but instead of having all these physical materials, we have computers in front of them instead of having the physical documents. So some of these settings will actually have desks that are actually concealed, that conceal their computer screens. Then we have keyboards that are beneath some glass surfaces. Now, why do we have all this setup? Or do we have all this setting? Now, the purpose is actually to make sure that we are promoting team interaction, and we are ensuring that we have technology that remains an enabler, or that remains an enabler but not the focal point of the decision making. In other words, we are not going to use this technology as the center of our decision making. So the automated JAD will use groupware packages in their sessions. And these groupware packages have abilities that actually fall into three categories. And the first category is the capabilities of generating information, that is information generation. We have the capabilities of analyzing information or maybe making decisions, that is information analysis or decision making. And we also have the capability of information documentation. So these groupware packages that are used, they have capabilities that fall into three categories. The first one is information generation, the second one is information analysis or decision making, and the third one is information documentation. So if we look at the information generation capabilities, it actually supports the generation of information by a large group of people. This can also actually improve, or it can actually prove to be less time consuming. We have information being generated by a large group of people in a short period of time. So it is going to provide the anonymity for the participants who are otherwise might not have wanted to share their ideas aloud. Yeah. So it is a feature that reduces the role of the facilitator as the intermediary here, because we have fewer confrontations that are actually arising than when we actually have contributors all debating ideas. So just like the information generation capability provides simultaneous generation of ideas, we have the information analysis or the decision portion that will help us in simulating the analysis of the information that we actually obtained from the various users. So we have users that identify, as users are actually identifying the basic activity and the data. The metrics capability here can actually be used to translate these lists into two axes that the participants can use to analyze the activity or maybe the data relationships. So the groupware here can also implement voting tools to make sure that they generate a vote for different system features. So they are voting tools that can be used to generate a vote for which feature is supported by majority of the people. So when this voting is complete, then we have the facilitator now displaying the results to everyone. So everyone is able to see the results of the voting on their screens. Okay. So the groupware's final category is actually the information documentation, which is a self-documenting process. It is an instant record of all the information that the participants generate. So the information that the participants generate is automatically or instantly recorded. Yeah, the information from all the analyses that have been conducted, and even all the decisions that are reached, is actually uh, documented at an instance. Okay, let's talk about prototyping as the other form of contemporary requirement gathering method. When I say contemporary, I mean a different form from the traditional methods that we have discussed. So prototyping is basically uh, an iterative process that involves users interaction heavily. So we have the users that provides requirements here, and then we have the analyst that can actually put in these requirements and show the user outcome. So in prototyping, we actually depend on the user interaction, and we cannot utilize prototyping as a method on its own for requirements gathering. We have the analyst here that must interview or maybe perform some task of requirement gathering before they even begin the prototyping. But again, or however, this prototyping is effective, especially when it comes to specifying the requirements, because it has it heavily involves the user. Now, the user in this prototyping will still be sitting side by side with the analyst. They provide them the requirements. Then the analyst enters those requirements into a system, into a working system, and this is going to actually allow the user to instantly see the outcome of their requirements. Now, if the user sees the requirements at an instance, then it means at that particular point, the user might actually change some of the requirements. So they may see what they provided was not what they had actually had in mind, and then they change that requirement. Okay. So for example, if it was maybe the requirements of a form, a registration form, and they see that the form will be cluttered, then they can omit some information, they can adjust some information. Okay. It can also be the case if a user, for example, forgets some important information. They might not realize that until they now see the working version of the system. So when they see the working version of the system, then they remember that there's some information they had left out. Okay. So in this prototyping, then we are going to have the last prototype that is going to be used as actually a model to build the actual system. Now, some of the disadvantages of prototyping is that we will have the user to actually pay too much attention to the details on the screen. The user will need to look into the screen and give attention to the details that are actually on the screen, rather than actually paying attention to what the prototype is communicating. So the other advantage, apart from paying too much attention to the screens than what the prototype is communicating, is that we can have impatient executives. Yeah, they see a complete prototype, but they don't understand why the finished system is actually taking too long to be complete. So we have executives that are actually impatient. So just to conclude on that, we have many different methods that are used in gathering requirements. All of these methods have their own advantages. They have their own disadvantages in terms of cost, in terms of time. But cost and time is they're actually the most proved factors, the most important proved factors when you are deciding which method to actually use. So we have we have many methods that can be used to supplement each other. Like we've mentioned about the prototyping, we've talked about the analysis of a existing or review of existing documents. The user observation can actually be used in interviews. We can do that in questionnaires. We can do that in analyzing documents. So we can use some other methods with other methods together. So for this lesson, I'll stop there. Let's meet in the other lesson where we'll be talking about the differences with different areas of work in which other information system professionals may operate.